If you would have asked me 10 years ago what I thought the greatest video game studio of all time was, I would have, without any hesitation, have told you BioWare. From the late 1990s and on into the 2000s, BioWare was almost universally considered, by both fans and critics alike, as not only the premier developer for games in the CRPG genre, but the gold standard when it came to crafting rich narratives, complex worlds, and dynamic characters. While praised for their engaging gameplay, the true defining feature of BioWare titles was its strong writing. Story first was the company's motto, and for nearly 2 decades, when it came to writing, there were very few games that even came close to rivaling those produced by BioWare. The quality was consistent, being so good, in fact, that even the studio's most divisive games were beloved by their most critical fans, something that cannot be said very often, especially in the current video game landscape. In spite of all their flaws, BioWare, from the release of their most famous title, Baldur's Gate, in 1998, and through the late 2010s, did not release a single game that could really be considered bad by any meaningful metric. As someone who values narrative above all else when it comes to my own personal selective taste in video games, BioWare titles offered everything I could have ever wanted in a game. My first introduction to BioWare, and the CRP genre as a whole, was in the summer of 2009. One of my favorite video games at the time was the original Star Wars Battlefront 2 by the now defunct Pandemic Studios. I unfortunately did not own a copy of this game myself, and so, over the years, I would often invite myself over to various friends' houses just so I could get my fix. After about 4 years of doing this, I finally decided, once I had the money to afford it, that I would go ahead and buy a copy for myself on the PC. But when I showed up to the local Best Buy, with a smile on my face and a wad of cash in hand, I was disappointed to find out that, despite having called the day before for confirmation that it was in stock, the final copy had been sold earlier that morning. Fueled by the need for instant gratification, and at the recommendation of one of the employees, I decided to do what I thought would be the next best thing and buy the first game instead, which was available in a bundle along with several other classic Star Wars games that I had never played before. In hindsight, I can't emphasize how grateful I am to whoever bought that last copy of Battlefront 2. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been introduced to the CRP genre in the form of one of the best, if not the best, Star Wars game ever made. To this day, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic stands as the single greatest video game experience of my life, and it still remains my favorite video game of all time. Suffice it to say, I was blown away. The story, the characters, the writing, the voice acting, everything. It was quite literally everything I could have ever wanted in not just a Star Wars game, but a video game as a whole. While it wouldn't be an entire 3 more years until I would play another BioWare game, that being the first Mass Effect, the studio was fully on my radar. It was a little bit later when I first played, and subsequently fell in love with, the series that serves as the subject of this video, Dragon Age. Namely, Dragon Age Origins. Intended as the spiritual successor to BioWare's previous Baldur's Gate games, Dragon Age Origins was an experience like no other, combining a similar gameplay style to that of KOTOR with a dark fantasy setting. I played Origins around the time Game of Thrones was at the height of its popularity, and as someone who was a fan of the show and the Song of Ice and Fire book series, which I was in the middle of reading, the game blew me away. While it did not resonate with me as much as the Mass Effect trilogy, which I completed later that year, it easily became a favorite of mine. Thus, I was excited when I found out a third Dragon Age game, titled Inquisition, was scheduled for release later that year, which I purchased upon release. However, while it had its strengths, Inquisition proved rather disappointing to me and many other fans, despite being named 2014's Game of the Year. Dragon Age Inquisition is often regarded as the last great game from BioWare. However, its release also marked the beginning of a gradual decline for the company, driven in part by internal changes and external pressures. Following Inquisition, several key developers who had been instrumental in shaping BioWare's golden years began to leave the studio. Founders Ray Muzyka and Greg Zeschuk, as well as prominent figures like Drew Karpyshyn and David Gaider, departed, taking with them the creative vision and leadership that had defined BioWare's earlier successes. By the late 2010s, it was clear that BioWare was no longer the same studio that had delivered classics like Baldur's Gate, Mass Effect, and, of course, Dragon Age Origins. This shift became apparent with the release of Mass Effect Andromeda in 2017. While the game had its merits, particularly in its rich exploration mechanics and some endearing character moments, it was widely viewed as a step down from the original Mass Effect trilogy. The spin-off was plagued by technical issues at launch, including stiff animations and numerous bugs, which overshadowed the narrative and gameplay improvements. Though some fans appreciated Andromeda for what it was, particularly in its combat, it lacked the polish and emotional weight that had become synonymous with BioWare's earlier games, leading to middling reviews and disappointing sales. The studio's troubles culminated in the release of Anthem in 2019, a live service game that was meant to be a bold new direction for BioWare. Instead, Anthem became a cautionary tale of mismanagement and unfulfilled promises. Despite its stunning visuals and potential for engaging gameplay, Anthem suffered from a lack of meaningful content, repetitive missions, and a poorly executed live service model. The game's development was marred by a chaotic production cycle with reports of crunch, indecision, and a lack of clear direction. Upon release, Anthem was met with widespread disappointment and is now often regarded as the biggest failure in BioWare's history. These missteps marked a turning point for BioWare. The studio that had once been synonymous with quality storytelling and immersive RPGs seemed increasingly at odds with the expectations of its fans and the realities of a rapidly changing gaming industry. While Dragon Age Inquisition remains a testament to their former greatness, the years that followed revealed a BioWare struggling to find its identity in a new era. Unfortunately, the identity of the studio has since found, as evidenced with the release of the latest Dragon Age game, has proven to be a far cry from BioWare's identity of old. The release of Dragon Age: The Veilguard has sparked a heated debate among fans and critics alike. Amidst this discourse are complaints that the series has quote-unquote gone woke, suggesting that its narrative has become too fixated on political correctness, social justice, or progressive agendas. In the case of The Veilguard, this is absolutely the case. It is very clearly heavy-handed in its sloppy attempt to convey its progressive message. But saying that The Veilguard is woke is not the same as to say that the series has quote-unquote gone woke. And I question whether those who state the latter have ever actually played the series to begin with. Because the fact of the matter is that Dragon Age has always been woke, at least depending on how one seeks to define the word itself. Much like the words racist and fascist, the meaning of the term woke is incredibly nebulous. Originally, it was used as a positive term to describe being aware to social injustices. However, in recent years, it has come to be used as a pejorative, synonymous to political correctness. Nonetheless, what constitutes as wokeness, quote-unquote, is illy defined. Sometimes the label is used to refer to a very particular kind of cringe, heavy-handed political correctness, while others use it as a catch-all term to describe progressivism as a whole. The Dragon Age series has always been woke. Thus, many who subscribe to the latter definition would be wrong in saying that the series has, quote-unquote, become woke, given that, by this categorical definition, the series has always been woke. In response to the initial criticisms in response to the Veilguard's announcement, former BioWare writer David Gator, who is responsible for writing the previous games in the series, had to say, apparently the usual suspects are upset at how woke the new Dragon Age is, an apparently sudden and unexpected development of the series. They are effing tourists. And to this statement I would have to agree. As stated above, if one is to define woke as being synonymous with progressive, Gator is absolutely correct. Which is why I question whether those who claim that the series has gone woke were actually fans of Dragon Age in the first place. While criticisms of the Veilguard are not themselves misguided, and are effectively correct, they are only accurate if one were to define woke in a more contextual sense, for these criticisms to be validated. Therefore, I would like to go ahead and make a distinction between the terms woke and progressive. While progressive messages are certainly a core component of what some would call wokeness, I would argue that progressive themes do not automatically make a piece of media woke. Instead, wokeness is better understood as a particular way of presenting progressive ideas, often characterized by overt, often heavy-handed messaging, and a clear intent to align with contemporary socio-political movements.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be, when it fits a woman.
So, by this more nuanced definition, while the Dragon Age series has always been progressive, it has not necessarily always been woke. Before diving into the specifics of Dragon Age, it's important to clarify the distinction between progressive and woke. Progressive generally refers to ideas and actions that allegedly seek to promote social change, equality, and justice, often focusing on issues like race, gender, sexuality, and class. Progressive themes in storytelling might involve highlighting the struggle of certain groups, advocating for social justice, or challenging established power structures. Woke, on the other hand, I would use to refer not only to the presence of progressive themes, but to the way in which these themes are presented within a narrative. Wokeness is often characterized by a direct and overt approach to progressive messaging, where the agenda behind the themes become a central focus. Wokeness can therefore sometimes manifest as prioritizing message over world building or storytelling, leading to moments where the narrative seems to break its own immersion to deliver a moral or political lesson. In this sense, being woke is not simply about promoting progressive ideas, but about the way in which those ideas are integrated, or, at times, imposed upon the story.
You are racist.
With this distinction in mind, it becomes clear that while the Dragon Age series has always been progressive, it hasn't always been woke. However, as the series progressed, even as early as Inquisition, the narrative became more and more overt in its messaging, laying the groundwork for the more direct wokeness seen in the Veilguard. From its inception, Dragon Age has engaged with progressive themes, often utilizing its rich world building to explore issues of discrimination, inequality, and the treatment of marginalized groups. In Dragon Age Origins, for example, the elves are portrayed as an oppressed minority confined to squalid alienages and treated as second-class citizens. This depiction of systemic inequality was intended to serve as an allegory for real-world race relations, and is handled in a way that feels organic to the world of Thedas. The game doesn't explicitly preach about racism or social justice. Instead, it uses the elven experience to reflect these issues through a fantasy lens. Similarly, the unique depiction of mages as a marginalized group, a feature of Dragon Age's world-building that is unique compared to how magic is typically depicted in most other fantasy media, presents a similar thought-provoking allegory. This was alluded to in Dragon Age Origins, and later became a central theme in the sequel, namely in Anders' story arc, a plot point which was sadly abandoned in later sequels. Likewise, this series has consistently included LGBT representation, which, while progressive, is often presented subtly and naturally within the story. Characters like Zevran in Origins or Anders and Fenris in Dragon Age 2 are given the freedom to express their sexuality as part of their broader character arcs, without their identities being reduced to a singular political statement. In these earlier games, the sexual orientation of characters is woven into the narrative in a way that enhances their complexity rather than serving as a focal point for ham-fisted moral lessons. In Dragon Age Inquisition, we see perhaps the clearest example of progressive themes executed well in the character of Dorian. Dorian's homosexuality is central to his backstory, particularly in his strained relationship with his father, who sought to, quote-unquote, cure him of his ailment. However, Dorian's story is not solely about his sexuality. He is also a brilliant mage, a political exile, and a key player in the Tevinter Imperium's complex power dynamics. His sexuality is an important part of who he is, but is not the driving force behind his entire character arc, nor is it presented as a direct political statement aimed at the player. Now, compare this to the character of Taj in Dragon Age the Veilguard, whose entire story arc revolves around them being non-binary.
So, I'm non-binary.
Although the characterization of both Dorian and Taj share a common political angle on behalf of the writers and their beliefs, the quality of the writing is vastly different. Dorian is written in such a way that his story feels natural to the world of the game, whereas Taj feels like they're straight out of a cringe, poorly written LGBTQ+ YA novel.
So, I'm non-binary.
This is a major problem when it comes to immersion, especially in a series that still has the gall to market itself as dark fantasy, a categorical genre label that arguably hasn't described the series since Origins. While the Dragon Age series has always been progressive, it wasn't until Dragon Age Inquisition that we began to see the first signs of what could be called overt wokeness. In Inquisition, released in 2014, in the aftermath of Gamergate, the progressive themes that had previously been woven into the world's lore and characters began to surface more prominently within the narrative. The game still maintained the rich world-building and complex storytelling that fans had come to love, but there were moments when the messaging became more explicit. The treatment of the mages, for example, became less about exploring the power dynamics within Thedas, and more about making overt, often shallow statements about oppression and freedom. This is something I noticed back when I first played the game, which I personally did not enjoy nearly as much as the previous two entries, namely due to the pacing of the story, the lackluster villain, the grindy MMO-like gameplay, and its more forgettable characters. Where Dorian was an exception to this, ironically having the most well-developed romance in the game, the heavy-handed political correctness is evident in characters like Krem, who is depicted as openly trans. Personally, this characterization took me out of the immersion, as it did not feel appropriate in a medieval-like fantasy setting. The issue was not necessarily that Krem identified as the opposite gender, but rather that they were open about their identity in a world that, in previous titles, illustrated a society defined by rigid traditional social norms, not unlike those of medieval Christendom. Krem wasn't necessarily a poorly written character. In fact, there's an argument to be made that they are the best representation of a trans character in gaming, but they do not feel like an appropriate fit for the world of Dragon Age within the context of that particular universe. Inquisition's depiction of a trans character is nonetheless far more natural and believable, at least in comparison to someone like Tash, whose central defining character trait is, quite literally, being non-binary.
I'm non-binary.
Where Taj is in your face about their identity and tells the player up front, in modern 21st century language, Krem is not. Instead, their identity is revealed to the player over time and through more nuanced dialogue. I myself did not even realize that they were trans until hours after they were introduced. And while the Iron Bull, the commanding officer of the mercenary band to which Krem is a leading member, does get slightly preachy when discussing Krem's identity, it is nowhere near as heavy-handed as the way in which the Veilguard approaches similar discussions. Nevertheless, Inquisition can be seen as a sort of transitionary marker, where the series began to change from being merely progressive to something that can more aptly be labeled as woke, if we are to define this term on the basis of how progressive themes are conveyed, rather than a simple synonym for progressive itself. However, it is with the Veilguard that this shift becomes most apparent. In the Veilguard, the narrative often feels as though it is prioritizing political messaging over storytelling. The game frequently steps outside of its own lore to deliver direct commentary on modern-day social justice issues, such as equality and representation, in ways that can feel jarring.
I'm non-binary.
The dialogue and narrative choices sometimes mirror contemporary political debates more closely than they reflect the internal logic of Thetis, leading to moments where the storytelling feels forced or out of place. For example, there are instances in the Veilguard where characters discuss social justice in terms that feel more appropriate for a 21st century political rally than a medieval fantasy setting. These moments break immersion and can make the game feel more like a platform for political messaging than a cohesive story set in a richly imagined world. This shift in tone is what many critics refer to when they say the series has gone woke. It's not the presence of progressive themes that is the issue. It's the way in which those themes are presented, often in a way that feels more like a lecture than a story. In what is perhaps the most infamous of Veilguard's quote-unquote woke scenes, the privateer Isabella, who was previously a main character in Dragon Age 2, accidentally misgenders Tash, offering a drawn-out apology followed by a lengthy, poorly written lecture about misgendering, essentially telling the player that such a faux pas merits a struggle session. The key issue with the Veilguard is not that it contains progressive themes, but how those themes are conveyed. To better understand this, we can compare the Veilguard to another recent RPG, Larian Studios' Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3, like Dragon Age, contains some progressive themes, but does so in a way that feels more organic and integrated into the world. In Baldur's Gate 3, characters like Asterion and Halzin, who are depicted as bisexual, are written as fully realized individuals whose sexualities are just one aspect of their characters. Asterion, for example, is a vampire spawn who was enslaved by his master for centuries. His story is one of trauma, survival, and liberation, and while his sexuality is part of his identity, it is not the sole focus of his character arc. The game allows Asterion to be a complex, multifaceted character, and his personal struggles are deeply rooted in the lore and world of Faerun. In contrast, the Veilguard struggles to balance its progressive themes with its world building. There are moments where the game seems more concerned with delivering a political message than maintaining the integrity of its story. For example, some characters' dialogue feels more like a direct commentary on modern-day politics than a natural extension of their personalities or the world that they inhabit. This approach can make the game feel disjointed, and from this it becomes clear that the writers are more interested in aligning with contemporary political movements than in telling a compelling story. Given the trajectory of the Dragon Age series and the broader cultural context in which it exists, It seems almost inevitable that the franchise would become more overtly woke over time. As our culture has become more obsessed with these issues, it was only a matter of time before these concerns would be reflected more explicitly in media, including video games. Dragon Age, with its long history of progressive themes, was perhaps more primed for this shift than most other franchises. However, this shift towards wokeness has also raised questions about the balance between storytelling and messaging. While it's fine for media to engage with social issues, the challenge lies in doing so in a way that feels authentic to the world and characters, rather than imposing contemporary political agendas onto a fantasy setting where they simply do not fit. In the case of the Veilguard, the overt wokeness of the narrative has led to moments where the storytelling feels compromised, as though the game is more concerned with making a statement than telling a cohesive story within the rich world of Thetis. The distinction between what makes something colloquially woke, i.e. merely progressive, and overtly woke, lies in how progressive themes are presented. In earlier games, progressive ideas were woven subtly into the world and characters, allowing players to engage with them on their own terms. In the Veilguard, however, the messaging has become more direct, oftentimes to the detriment of the narrative. A major, often undiscussed example of this is in how demographics are depicted within the realm of Thetis throughout the series. In Origins, nearly all of the characters are fair-skinned, as the country of Ferelden. The kingdom in which the narrative is set is shown as a loose analogy for northern medieval Europe, particularly England. The demographics reflect this, but by Inquisition, which is also set in Ferelden, the human population is far more ethnically diverse, with the world all of a sudden being populated by characters resembling Black Africans and East Asians. This is inconsistent with the world that was shown to us in Dragon Age Origins. This would be far more forgivable if there was some kind of in-world explanation for this major demographic shift, but none is ever given, thus breaking the immersion. This is unfortunately something that has become all too common in contemporary fantasy media, such as Netflix's The Witcher and Amazon Prime's billion-dollar blunder, The Rings of Power, where European-inspired communities are shown as ethnically diverse. This is not to say that ethnic diversity has no place in medieval-style fantasy, but it must fit within the context of the world itself to work. An example of a piece of media that does this well would be HBO's The House of the Dragon, which features some Black characters. However, their presence in Westeros makes sense within the context of the story. The population is still largely, for the lack of a better term, European, with the characters of color having, for one reason or another, migrated from more southern regions. Context is key, and within the context of the world established in Dragon Age Origins, the multicultural society of Northern Thetis, shown in Inquisition and the Veilguard, doesn't make much sense. The world of Northern Thetis is not the same as that of the Sword Coast, the setting of games such as Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, which, according to its established lore, is a bustling haven for commerce and exploration with metropolitan cities not dissimilar to those of the Mediterranean during the Renaissance period. Thus, multicultural communities fit in accordance to the lore of the Forgotten Realms. While BioWare was able to get away with depicting a more ethnically diverse world in Dragon Age 2, which is itself set in the Free Marches, the same cannot be said for countries like Ferelden, Orlais, and Tevinter, where other games in the series are set. One of the major early criticisms of the Veilguard concerned the option to choose top scars in the character creator. This trans representation, however, is not limited to the character creator. Veilguard also includes gender identity-specific dialogue options so that the player may affirm their trans identity should they choose to roleplay as such. However, much like Tasha's story arc, the dialogue comes across as clumsy, out of place, and ham-fisted.
I'm non-binary.
The existence of sex-change surgery in the world of Dragon Age, a world that reflects the technological and scientific landscape of medieval Europe, again appears out of place. I would also question why, in a world of magic, sex-change operations would be necessary. Sex-change operations are a form of cosmetic surgery and do not alter one's innate chromosomes. In a rich world filled with magic, where a mage can alter their own form, wouldn't it be far easier and ideal for an individual to use magic as a means to more authentically alter their biology? In such a world, why would somebody undergo a mere cosmetic surgery to look like the opposite sex when they could actually become the opposite sex? Additionally, Why would a trans player create a character who is trans when they can actually roleplay as somebody who belongs to the gender to which they actually identify? For decades, this is what trans players have done, and one would think that they would rather do this than roleplay as a transsexual. The gaming industry's efforts to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion have been met with both critical acclaim and significant resistance from segments of the player base. Changes to established characters have become points of contention. Similarly, new character rosters designed to emphasize inclusivity often fail to create a strong connection with audiences. In contrast, games from Eastern developers like Black Myth Wukong and Stellar Blade have achieved remarkable commercial and critical success. The appearance and identity of characters clearly influence the reception of a game, but they are not the sole factors that determine its impact. While some players value representation that aligns with their real-world identity, most prefer to engage with roles and stories far removed from their personal experiences. Research shows that personal representation in games is not always necessary for player satisfaction. Attempts at forced representation can sometimes detract from the overall gaming experience, and can even negatively affect one's own personal self-esteem. After all, video games, especially those within the fantasy genre, are intended as a form of escapism from real life. For a more in-depth look into this phenomenon, I highly recommend checking out my friend Aiden Paladin's video on the topic, which I've gone ahead and linked in the description below. Moving on, it is essential to recognize that the quality of a game is not determined by whether or not it contains political or social messages, but by how well those messages are integrated into the narrative and gameplay. Political themes, whether progressive, conservative, or somewhere in between, can enhance a game's story and characters when handled thoughtfully. However, when these themes are presented in a heavy-handed or overtly didactic manner, they can detract from immersion and weaken the overall quality of the game. This principle applies equally to both progressive messages, which are more common in modern gaming, and conservative themes, which, while rarer, can be just as off-putting if poorly executed. A well-integrated political message enriches the story and characters without feeling forced. For example, the Last of Us series features diverse sexual representation, gender identity, and themes concerning the cyclical nature of violence and conflict. Despite controversy in some circles, particularly regarding the sequel, the messages are more naturally embedded within the emotional and character-driven narrative. Ellie's relationship with Riley in the first game's Left Behind expansion is not merely a message about LGBT inclusion. Rather, it is central to Ellie's character development and the story's emotional core. In this way, such themes serve to deepen the player's connection to the characters in the world, rather than feeling like an overt political statement. In contrast, when political messaging is too overt or clumsily executed, it can detract from the experience. Dragon Age the Veilguard places a more explicit focus on certain social justice themes, such as gender identity, that feel out of place within the established lore of Thedas.
I'm non-binary.
And, frankly, come across as rather frivolous given the apocalyptic stakes that the narrative attempts to convey. While progressive themes dominate much of modern media, there are games that reflect more conservative or traditional values, and the same rules of integration apply. Kingdom Come: Deliverance is a notable example of a game that, while not overtly political, reflects a more traditional view of history and European culture, touching on themes such as the importance of order, honor, duty, and tradition. Set in the medieval kingdom of Bohemia, the game focuses on historical accuracy, portraying a world where religion, social hierarchy, and traditional gender roles dominate. The developers aim to create an immersive, historically grounded experience, which includes a predominantly white, Christian population reflective of 15th century Central Europe. In addition to its thematic elements, the game's commitment to historical authenticity can also be seen as aligning with more conservative or traditional values, particularly in how it resists modern pressures to diversify its cast or inject contemporary progressive ideals into its world. However, Kingdom Come: Deliverance, much like Dragon Age Origins and Baldur's Gate 3, avoids feeling like a political statement, because these elements are woven naturally into the fabric of its world and story. The game is not anti-progressive, but rather focuses on delivering a historically accurate experience that reflects the realities of its time period. The themes of social hierarchy, religious influence, and traditionalism are integral to the game's setting and narrative, allowing players to engage with the world without feeling as though they are being preached to. Just as with progressive themes, conservative messaging can feel forced and detract from quality when it is too heavy-handed. Imagine a game that, in response to perceived wokeness in modern media, goes out of its way to promote anti-woke themes, portraying things like traditional gender roles or skepticism of environmentalism in an overt and unsubtle manner.
I'm non-binary.
Imagine this game features a ruler who calls to make his kingdom great again, and who sends you on a quest to go build a wall to keep out the elves. Or, quite literally, includes dialogue that espouses BoomerCon talking points railing against wokeness itself. The problem here isn't the ideology, but rather how it is presented. A game that prioritizes pushing a political agenda, whether progressive or conservative, over crafting a compelling story, risks alienating its audience and sacrificing narrative depth. It's worth noting that games with overtly conservative messages are less common, likely due to the broader media establishment's progressive leanings. The gaming industry, much like Hollywood and other forms of entertainment, tends to favor progressive social values, leading to the more frequent inclusion of such themes related to diversity, inclusion, and social justice. This imbalance doesn't mean that games with conservative themes don't exist, but they're often subtler or positioned in ways that don't directly challenge the industry's dominant cultural narratives. For example, a game that espouses traditional family values or challenges modern social movements might face significant backlash from both the media and certain segments of the gaming community. This can create a kind of self-censorship, where developers avoid including more conservative themes for fear of being labeled regressive or out of touch. However, the lack of balance in political messaging does not change this fundamental rule. Whether a game is progressive or conservative, its quality is determined by how well these themes are integrated into the story and world building. When political themes, regardless of ideology, are handled with care and respect for the world and the characters, they can enhance the narrative and deepen the player's experiences. The success of any game, whether progressive, conservative, or apolitical, lies in its ability to tell a compelling story within a cohesive and immersive world. Themes of diversity, identity, and social progress can have a place in gaming, and, if executed correctly, can still provide meaningful engagement with real-world issues, regardless of whether the player agrees with those stances or not. However, when these themes are implemented without regard for the narrative, world building, or the established lore, they can alienate players and undermine the very messages that they aim to promote. Dragon Age: The Veilguard serves as a cautionary tale in this regard, where the prioritization of overt political messaging detracts from the richness of Thedas, a world beloved by gamers for its complexity and nuance. Unfortunately, given the harsh backlash and lackluster sales of the Veilguard, the future of the Dragon Age franchise, and, to a lesser extent, BioWare as a whole, appears bleak. Despite this, fans of the series would be wrong to simply give up on the genre as a whole. The fantasy genre is still ripe for possibilities, and the Veilguard's failure should not be hailed as a harbinger for the death of fantasy RPGs. With studios like Larian and Archetype, the latter of which was founded by former BioWare developers, the future of fantasy and science fiction role-playing games is nonetheless promising. As the gaming industry continues to evolve, developers should strive for balance, ensuring that political and social commentary enhances, rather than overshadows, the player experience. Fantasy worlds like Dragon Age are powerful because they transport players beyond the constraints of reality, offering a canvas for thoughtful exploration of timeless themes. When creators respect the internal logic of their settings and allow themes to arise organically, they foster deeper connections with their audiences, authenticity, and consistency, by keeping storytelling at the heart of the gaming experience.